bakers had a reputation for being very healthy and living long lives. But if you were unfortunate enough to actually get sick, you might be sent here to the nurse shop. And look at this, an adult-sized cradle. If you didn't feel well, you might be placed in it and rocked to sleep. What a great idea, lost in history. Now over here is another thing that's been lost in history. The washstand, now replaced by the bathroom vanity. It contains a bowl and a pitcher, but look at the cabinet. A nice small raised panel door at the bottom, a drawer for some smaller items. But the thing that really interests me is the top portion of it. The sides have been flared out, and it takes what might otherwise be a very clumsy piece and makes it very elegant. Now, I'd also like to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. But remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now I'll show you how I built today's project. When I built our version of the washstand, I only found one thing that was mildly difficult, and that was making sure that all these through dovetails were correctly aligned. And that's because the sides are slightly tilted at about a 5-degree angle, so that gets a little bit tricky. The rest of the project is pretty straightforward. And the first thing I did was glued up several panels. And those are for the backsplash, the counter. There's a couple for the sides. And here we have an intermediate shelf, a bottom shelf, and the drawer rides on a solid panel. Now they're all just glue and reinforced with biscuits. And now that I've scraped all the excess glue, I'm ready to give each side a light sanding with my belt sander. Well, the next step is to rip the panels to the correct width, and that's what this is all about. The first thing I do is take the joiner and make one pass so that I have a perfectly straight and square edge, so that as that edge rides up against the rip fence, the cut on the other side will be perfectly parallel. Well, now I've actually ripped this piece about a 32nd of an inch too wide, or strong as we say. And even though the saw blade gives me a pretty smooth cut, the joiner will make it perfect. Well, the next thing to do is to cut my panels to length. I'm going to use my new factory-made panel cutter. It has a huge work surface and a couple guides that run in the miter slots of the table saw. It also has a fence along the back, which is perpendicular to the blade. And the first thing I want to do is square up one end of each panel blank. Now, one thing that my homemade panel cutter that you've seen me use several times doesn't have is a built-in measuring device and a stop system. This one, all I have to do is align my stop to the measurement I want, in this case 21 1/4, butt my piece up against the screw, and I can cut the other end. Now the shelves and the drawer support are let into the sides. They fit into dados. Now I'll cut those dados over on the table saw. Now there's a dado for the drawer support. And that takes care of the dado for the bottom shelf. And that's the one for the middle shelf. Now the back of the cabinet is closed in with a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. And so that I don't see the edge grain of the plywood, I've made a little 3/8-inch rabbet up the edge of each side. Now I'm going to use the table saw and the dado head cutter, but I've installed an auxiliary wood fence to protect my good fence, and I've covered all but 3/8 of an inch of the dado cutter. And now I'm ready to run the back edge through. Okay, basically a little bit of glue in each dado joint and some 4-penny finish nails hold it all together. Well, now I'll put the back on using some glue and brads. Now this little 1x2 cleat goes at the top edge of the plywood to reinforce it, make it stiffer, and it'll give me a place for the top to rest on. I've just made a little notch in the top front corner of the top shelf, and that's to receive the stiles a little bit later. Now, I've just made a notch in one of the stiles. You can see from the back side it's overcut. That doesn't be evident, you won't see it. It just fits around the top shelf like that. This little piece here is a rail. It actually joins the two stiles together at the bottom of the cabinet. I'm going to put a pencil mark across each joint so I can cut some slots. So I want to reinforce the joint with these hardwood splines. Now with glue and the biscuit in place, you just slip this together, make sure that the joint is nice and tight, and nail it off. Before I do any routing, I'll sand the side of the stile flush with the side of the cabinet. Well, now I've just rounded over the outside corner of the stile using my router, which is equipped with a 1/4-inch radius rounding over bit. Well, I've just made a V-groove along the edge of that front stile. And to make it, I use my router, which is equipped with a V-grooving bit, and this fence to guide it along the side of the cabinet. Now I'll just turn the cabinet around and do the same thing to the face of the stile. Well, that takes care of the base cabinet. Now let's start working on the washstand. And the first piece I want to cut is the backsplash. I've already ripped the board to the right width, 11.5 inches, and I've got to cut the ends at a slight angle, 5 degrees. So I've taken my miter gauge, turned it to 5 degrees, and now we're ready to make the cuts. Because the sides of the washstand are flared out, and the front is flared out, I have to modify the bottom edges of the three pieces. I'll show you why. If I hold a square here as a straight edge along the front, you can see that there's a gap at the bottom of the side piece. And the way to eliminate that is to take it over on the joiner and plane it at 5 degrees. Well, now I'm ready to cut the front piece to length. It'll be cut at the same 5 degrees as I did on the backsplash. Now here's the layout for the side piece. A 90-degree cut up the back side and a 5-degree cut off of vertical on the front edge. Okay, well, I've just spent about 20 minutes setting up my dovetailing jig for those through dovetails. I've adjusted all these guide fingers to the spacing that I want, and I've taken my router and I've installed a dovetailing bit and this little collar here which will follow the guide fingers. And now I'm ready to cut the tails in the side pieces. Okay, that takes care of the side pieces. Now I'll change the bit in the router and we'll set up to cut the pins in the front and back piece. Now, in the front corners of the original washstand, the dovetails didn't come all the way through. They stopped, and the top was mitered. And I thought that was a nice little detail, so I'm going to carry that out on my version, and I'll make the cuts with this little saw. This side's pretty good. Yeah, this is still a little long. You see there's a little bit of a space in there, so I'm just going to take my saw and run it between the joint to trim a little bit off, and then it should fit okay. Yeah, that did it. Now the corner fits good, the dovetails, but the side seems to be just a bit higher than the front. So I'm going to even those out using my rasp. Okay, those are nice and even. Now before I glue it up, I'm going to take it apart and round over all the top edges. Okay, that takes care of the top edge of the backsplash, and to round that over I used a 1/2-inch radius bit. Now for the top edges of the sides and the front, I'm using a 3/8-inch radius bit, but I've only raised it up just a little bit. Just want to knock the corners off. There's one more thing to do to the backsplash. I want to put a rabbet in it back here because this countertop is going to expand and contract. And I'm afraid that if it shrinks, I'll end up with a gap, and if it expands, it might push it apart. So by having a rabbet, that'll give it room to move. You just spread a thin coat on all the right surfaces, and then fit it together. Okay, now I'm just going to put a couple clamps on as necessary to squeeze these joints tight to get tightly together while they cure. Okay, now the bottom of the washstand has to fit inside the frame. And remember, the sides are flared out at 5 degrees. So I've set up my table saw to make all the bevel cuts with the blade also tilted at 5 degrees to match the frame. Let's going to fit pretty good. Now, no glue here, just nails. I want it to be able to move around. The door for our washstand consists of stiles, rails, and a raised panel, and they're held together with mortise and tenon joints. The first thing I want to do is make a groove to hold the panel in these 4 frame members. Now there's one of the mortises in the stile, about 1 3/4 inches deep, and I made it using my drill press, which is outfitted with this mortising attachment. And it's really nothing more than a square chisel with a drill that goes down through it. And the drill does most of the work, and the chisel just squares it up. On the original door, I noticed that the inner edges of the stiles and rails were just slightly beveled. It's very subtle. So to do that, I've set up my joiner, and I've tilted the fence to 15 degrees, and now I'll run the pieces through. Okay, now I'm ready to start working on the tenons, and this is what a finished tenon will look like. The first cut that I want to make is this shoulder cut right here, which is on the inside of the door. So I've set up a gauge block, which gives me the right length for the tenon, and I've raised the blade to the proper height. Now I'll run the rails through. Now I'm ready to make this little haunch cut in the tenon. And that's necessary because when you slip it together into the stile, you don't want to have a gap from the groove, and that fills that space up. The next thing I want to do is make the cheek cuts on each side of the tenon. Now, because the tenon is not perfectly centered, there'll be 2 setups. But first I'll cut the side that's the face side of the door. I'll use my 10-inch jig, and I'm all set up to go. Okay, that should be the adjustment for the other side. Well, you could raise a panel for a door a lot of different ways. You could use a table saw, you could use a router, but nothing beats the shaper. It does the best job. That panel fits in there pretty good. No glue there, though. That should just float. I've already applied the glue to the tenons. And we'll just slip this stile on, clamp it up, and pin it all together with some dowels. Okay, those are all the parts for my drawer. Here are the 2 sides, and I've already used a dado cutter to put a groove along the bottom edge for the plywood. I've also put a groove at this end of the side piece, and that's for the back to fit into. Now the front piece, which I just rabbited along the bottom edge and the ends, will be connected to the side piece by means of half-blind dovetails. see how that fits together. This is known as a half-line dovetail because you only see one side of it. That's pretty good. Now with this little sliding jig that rides on my rip fence, I'm able to chamfer the edges on the front of the draw front just like the original. These biscuits, with a little bit of glue, will secure the washstand to the base. Okay, it looks pretty good. Now there's only one more detail left. Well, it looks like this is ready for some paint and some stain. Well, now the finishing scheme for our washstand is to paint the bottom a nice putty color. And up at the top, I'm going to use a clear, water-soluble polyurethane because paint might chip, and I don't want to cover up these dovetails. I want them to show. Now, this will give me a nice, hard, durable finish. And it won't yellow. Now, this is the first of two coats for the base. It's a latex underbody. It's not the final color. That goes on next. Well, what do you think? The manufacturer of this acrylic latex paint named it Hancock Gray, maybe after the Hancock Shaker Village. It's a nice old-timey color. Well, that's what our washstand looks like when it's all painted and urethane. And I can think of at least a dozen places where I can use this piece around my home.